Well, hello, welcome from rainy, gloomy Georgia, which I must admit I love, really love fall in this part of the country. Um, so in the episode today, it's going to talk about space warfare, doctrine, how to make some considerations if you want to actually write some sort of conflict or war into your science fiction stories. Um, And the first question, and this is an obvious one that I think unfortunately gets overlooked even in, human history, is think about why the entities in your story are fighting. What do they hope to accomplish by going to war? Um, because when you think about it, space is obviously really big. Uh, so if you come into conflict with a species or another political entity, from an economic standpoint, maybe you could just go one solar system over, colonize that, and everything's golden, right? So you don't have that necessarily that sort of territorial pressure that you get a lot of times here on Earth, I would say, or in more constrained environments. Um, and as part of that, space is actually fairly resource rich, at least compared to say Earth. Um, so, that kind of goes away. So consider the first thing is why are they fighting? Why aren't they just going one solar system over and just colonizing that? Okay. So one of the things that I think makes the most sense is as far as a conflict point is the same one that we have here on Earth, with our current fighting, um, and that is resources. Yeah, just because space is big, and just because it's resource rich doesn't necessarily mean that the specific resource that you're talking about is A, easy to get to, or B, abundant enough that it can easily be found and exploited. So I would say, most of the conflicts, and this may be controversial, but I think if you dig beneath a lot of the conflicts on Earth, even the ones that are supposedly about ideology or religion or anything like that, they end up boiling down to at the very base level of them to be about resources, either land or stuff that's on or under the land. Um, and I can't see that changing, assuming we ever get out of the gravity well. I think that kind of scarcity of resources conflict is going to continue. Uh, so if you're looking for an easy one, I would say that one is something that can translate fairly well into any sort of science fiction story. As an example, I would use say helium-3. It's a relatively scarce resource. Theoretically, has a lot of uses in say fusion reactors. So again, it would provide a pretty good conflict point for various intersolar political entities that are competing for these rather rare helium-3 deposits. Okay. Um, so if your war is about resources, this is going to be the stressor point between these political entities. How would they go about securing um, these resources? And there's a couple ways you can do it. The most obvious is one I touched on before. You can grab an asteroid, strap a couple booster rockets on it, drop it on whatever their base is, blow it to smithereens. Uh, Probably won't destroy the entire resource node there. Depending on how big the asteroid is that you drop, I guess that's a possibility. Um, but is that the most cost-effective way to do it? Because when you think about it, this entity, especially if you're talking about the same species, has so thoughtfully provided this a facility there to exploit this resource. Wouldn't it make more sense be able to take over this facility with no or minimal damage, and then just kind of use it that way? From a cost effectiveness standpoint, that's going to be the way that you would want to do it. Um, so when you think about that, the way that you fight these wars is actually going to be if it's over resources and if it's expensive to find and exploit these resources, the warfare that would kind of result from that is going to be fairly limited. because you don't want to blow the living crap out of this base because you're going to have to rebuild it. And while you're rebuilding it, you're not going to have access to this resource, and the opposing side can attack, your rebuilding team or whatever. So ideally, you want a way to take over these resources with their, relatively intact, including their defensive systems, so that you can exploit them for yourself. So how would you go about doing that? In previous the previous episode, I talked a lot about how kind of asymmetric warfare, like I don't know, special forces type things, uh, I think would still have a role, actually an exceedingly important role in warfare, especially if you're talking within the human species. And that kind of would play out in the scenario that I was just laying out for you. Um, Let me present to you the Special Forces hacker. Um, because this would be somebody that you would want to be able to somehow get on station or get close enough that they could access the whatever operating system or computer systems that this facility is using, and then B, somehow override or lower these defenses so that you could actually send somebody in from outside to take it over, because that would be ideal. Um, maybe you could shut off the life support systems, asphyxiate everybody or knock them out, and then your side waltzes in, takes over the base, everything's, now it's yours, minimal damage, perfect, good to go. And I think that would probably be one of the main ways that people would actually fight us, to capture these resources relatively intact, infiltrating both computer systems and humans, and somehow, uh, or convince, you could either do it politically, convincing the on station staff to rebel against whoever's controlling them. Um, but from a cost effectiveness standpoint, that's going to be by far the best way to control these resources. So warfare in this scenario is going to involve a lot of hacking, counter hacking, intrusion countermeasures, um, intelligence, both internal and external. Very much, I would say, like kind of like the Cold War was, in that you're very much trying to undermine the defenses of these bases so that you can take them out with minimal loss to yourself. And if it doesn't work out, you can say, "Oh, we had nothing," plausible deniability, because that way you keep these conflicts from escalating. So, controlling resources, especially in that scenario, like I said, very much a Cold War type of situation. Does that mean that you don't have, like a fleet to go take these things out? Um, well, I would say that they play a role as well, but in many ways, I would think that in the scenario that I just proposed to you, a fleet might be more of a psychological weapon than an actual physical one, although it would certainly be that as well. So what do I mean by that? If you're fighting over scarce resource points, and you want to take over the means of production intact, sending a battleship in to just blow the living crap out of it doesn't really make much sense. However, if said base is rebellious, they're having a hard time keeping this base under control, or you've actually got a team actually infiltrated there and about ready to take down the local defense network or damage it, um, having a battleship in close proximity would actually be really useful. Because again, as soon as the base defenses go down or damaged enough that you can get in there, you send the battleship in to defend this base while you make sure that the defenses have been switched over to your side, to suppress any remaining resistance, and to make sure that the opposing side can't just waltz in with their own battleship and take it back while you're trying to control it. So in this sense, this battleship or this I would argue that it makes more sense to have a carrier analog with this. Um, is basically supporting the main attack, which is going to be this infiltration attack that we talked about, um, and to provide psychological support if people are talking about rebelling, etc. Um, you could also use them to put pressure on different on the opposing political entity. If it's weaker than you are, you can send your battleship there as a way of kind of maybe threatening them, telling them, "Hey, we're taking this seriously. Get concessions out of this side." Encourage rebellion, things like that. In many ways, kind of what we use our carriers for today, in some ways. Although, again, they do have punch, obviously, to back up their psychological pressure. So, in many ways, warfare in this scenario is going to be low intensity. And I think consider doing that with your if you're talking about having a war in whatever worldview that you're building. Um, because when you think about building spaceships, most of the time it's going to be expensive. You don't necessarily want to lose them unless it's for a good cause, unless you're getting a good return on your investment, for example. Um, and if you're fighting over these scarce resources, again, you want to be able to capture these things in a cost-effective manner. So having these huge fleet engagements might not be the best way to go about it. So is there any other thing that you could be fighting over? Well, it's going to depend on your whatever scenario you're using. Um, and I'll get into interspecies conflicts at the end of this episode because I think those will be perhaps much different. But if we're talking about like within your own species, within humans, um, fighting over planets again is going to be kind of similar to what we were talking about with resources. You don't necessarily just want to drop asteroids on them because you'll destroy the colony. Why would you want it? In my scenario, like in Regnum Humanitas, trade lanes are the choke points that would need to be defended. Just real quickly, if you haven't seen that episode, trade in between the solar colonies involves these giant container ships that are in stable, static orbits. They basically orbit between the various colonies. Um, so they're big, everybody knows where they are, and nice, juicy targets for pirates, for example. Um, so those are kind of transportation bottlenecks. And in my scenario, the way that you would control those is basically send frigates out to just stage them kind of along these ways so that they can activate and intercept any sort of pirates that come in there. So if you have any sort of transportation bottlenecks, trade routes, for example, or um, if you were using faster than light technologies like warp gates or something like that, these would be other things that you would want to defend and that would find like conflict points between these various political entities. But again, the same thing applies. You don't necessarily want to destroy what you're trying to take. So I would consider, again, to go back to it, think about making this kind of low intensity conflict central to whatever your world is, just because it makes the most economic sense in a lot of ways. Um, so when does it make sense to have massive fleet battles like you see in, say, oh, one more thing. um, Also, when you're defending these various institutions, remember that uh, bullets, high velocity shrapnel missiles, railgun rounds continue until they hit something. And what I mean by that is, and this is actually something that got mentioned early on in the Mass Effect games, for example, is that just because you fire a railgun round and miss, I mean, it's going to end up somewhere, right? So if you're fighting around a planet, for example, and everybody's like shooting railgun rounds at each other and everything, remember that these high velocity projectiles are going to have to impact somewhere. So I would think it wouldn't be a good idea to do that around something that you're interested in capturing relatively intact. Even if you're firing torpedoes at each other, just destroying these torpedoes. Remember, these high velocity shrapnel clouds are going to, you know, potentially they can destroy the base. You know, so this is yet another argument for not firing off heavy weapons systems around something that you want to capture intact. Or if you're doing so, at least making sure that your backstop isn't the actual planet or base itself. Um, so again, yet another argument for sort of low intensity warfare. So let's go back to my initial war. Where would these huge fleet actions make sense? Well, in thinking about it, wars of annihilation, when you're not necessarily so concerned about capturing things intact, um, having huge fleet actions might actually make sense there. Um, yeah, sure, use the base. If you don't care about capturing the planet or the base intact, you can use heavy weapons around it with wild abandon, because you don't necessarily care if nothing's left of this place but a smoking crater after you're done. Um, this might have some relevance in that low intensity thing I was talking about. Maybe you're in a war where you're willing to capture a couple smoking ruins just to make your point. I would say that would be kind of rare, obviously. But where I think it would make more sense is if you're actually talking about a conflict between alien species. Um, in this case, it might very well be that you're fighting a war of annihilation. Um, uh, the resources out there, maybe the aliens want the resources. They're not necessarily going to be able to use your facilities because their physiology is going to be different. Um, so maybe they're not as concerned with capturing the base intact. In fact, it might make it easier for them to exploit whatever this resource is if they just wipe your base out and build theirs on top of it, for example. Um, and there might also be this sort of psychology behind it. If you're fighting because you want to eliminate a potential threat, these would be wars of extermination types of things. Um, Dropping rocks on each other is going to be probably the most cost effective way to do it. Um, so if you're trying to defend against people dropping rocks on you, you obviously have to send ships out to make sure that they can't do it, to stop them well away from your planet, so that they can't get a lot of these asteroids together and get them up to enough speed that there's no way that you can defend against them. In which case, you've got these sort of natural conflict points building up around like asteroids that are going to be particularly useful to send towards your planet. Um, and in that case, if you're talking about two species fighting, I think, annihilation might be, not great, not something you'd want to, but it might actually make more logical sense in that scenario. Um, Maybe they can't even live on your planet because again, their physiology is different. Maybe, bombarding your planet with asteroids for a couple of years and making it all cloudy and cold would actually fit their ideal habitat more. Um, but in the case of these interspecies conflicts, again, spying isn't necessarily going to be particularly useful unless you have some way of infiltrating a species. But even that's going to be exceedingly difficult. Even if you can mimic them physically, I mean, psychologically and all that kind of stuff, it's going to be exceedingly difficult. Without years, I would say, of scientific study of each other, in which case, you know, the chances of them finding your little spying operation, increase the longer that you have to do it to get an idea on how to infiltrate it. So if you are going to fight a war of annihilation, I would say that it probably makes most sense to fight it between two species that have different physical and psychological makeups. Is this to say that you can't have one between, say, humans? No, I mean, you can certainly do that as well. I mean, if you're having some sort of religious war. Uh, but again, this may be controversial, but I think even these religious wars, they always boil down to resources. So I'm not sure that, you know, if you're having a religious war, the opposing side just not, dropping asteroids on the opposing side's homeworld, it is even going to be that satisfying from a religious standpoint, because theoretically you'd want to take it over, right? Or maybe not. Maybe things have gotten so out of hand that that's your biggest option. Um, so, and I would say actually in this, the last thing I would say is the kind of the what we talked a little bit earlier about asymmetric warfare. I think that would make sense if you're talking about, say, fringe religious or ideological groups that aren't necessarily, like almost cults that aren't necessarily interested in capturing anything or at least a larger society intact. They're totally cool with dropping rocks on the, I don't know, flying planes into the skyscrapers and things like that. Um, because in that case, that kind of warfare, I think, again, would be very low key or low intensity, I would say, and very much based around, intelligence and special forces and things like that as a way of kind of almost like an internal thing to keep those groups dispersed and from ever getting the capability to attack these large facilities like we talked about. Um, so yeah, that's kind of the things I think would make a lot of sense to consider before you start talking about these giant interstellar wars. Um, what they're fighting over, you know, transportation bottlenecks, resource bottlenecks, uh, territory, I guess. But again, a lot of those things make more sense in an interspecies type conflict, and that would make a lot more sense to fight those low intensity, kind of like the Cold War-ish type of situation. Because again, ideally, you want to be able to attack to capture these facilities intact, so you don't have to rebuild them from an economical standpoint. Also, low intensity to monitor, control, and suppress any sort of ideological groups that might inflict damage without consideration for the longer term. So that would be low intensity as well. And even supporting these groups between opposing political entities, like say if you want to support a terrorist group in an opposing political entity, you'd have to strongly consider if that would be worthwhile or not, because again, they're primarily interested in short-term, narrow goals, which could conceivably involve destroying the entire facility that you might want to actually capture intact. And then if you're talking about like total war things, standard space battles between massive fleets, I think these make a lot more sense between opposing species, both because of the, you know, physiological makeup between them. Maybe they can't live on your home world, so in which case they wouldn't really care about dropping asteroids on it until it's a irradiated hellscape. Or just that kind of instinctual thing of like trying to get rid of a potential threat. Dropping asteroids on something else before it drops it on you, for example, uh, might make more sense. Okay, so consider that. Um, when you're talking about your war, what are they trying to achieve? Honestly, even in freaking history, humans are, there's been so many wars that have been fought where people didn't really think through what they were trying to accomplish. And so, don't do that in your um your space war. I mean, I guess you could if you're trying to be historically accurate, I guess, but yeah, think it through is all I'm saying. What are your wars going to accomplish? And then that would actually inform how they're fought. Okay. Um, I think in my next episode, I'm going to wrap it up here. I think in my next episode, I might start talking about different classes of ship that would make sense in this low intensity warfare that I was talking about. And so I'll go into some of those get beyond just that one single frigate design that I talked about in my realistic spaceships episode. Okay, so if you have any, if you vehemently disagree with me on any of this stuff, please feel free to put it in the comments. And otherwise, I will see you guys next week.